Hey, Karim Deen here, founder of Nude Human Consulting. The Coffee with Karim podcast aims to provide Muslims and people of all backgrounds a space to share their life gifts, meet dynamic guests, and enhance the human experience one cup of coffee at a time. Sit back and sip. Welcome to another episode of Coffee with Karim. Today I have a wonderful guest, Dr. Marwa Assar. She's a psychologist, educator, and writer dedicated to providing spiritual, mental, and emotional empowerment through psycho-spiritual education that is rooted in Islamic teachings. Dr. Marwa, thank you so much for being on the show today.
Oh, thank you for having me. I'm glad to be here.
So, Sister Marwa, I was very excited to have you on the show today because we had this collaboration a couple of years back for Muslim Wellness Foundation. There was a live webinar where you, myself, and I believe another brother named Ibrahim, we talked about Islamic psychology and started to share our own ideas about this and how it could actually look in counseling and helping our brothers and sisters. So I was very excited to see you be a part of this, and you gave a wonderful presentation that day.
First of all, I'm glad to be here. Thank you for having me. And I do remember that collaboration. It's great to see other people who are in the field and trying to merge these two worlds together, Islam and psychology.
Would you like to start off, Marwa, by telling us a bit more about you? Where'd you grow up? And was your family always religious, or was it something that you embodied from a young age or later in life?
As for me, I was raised in New Jersey, and yeah, my family, did raise me on the faith. They did teach me the faith, and they would take me to classes here and there. And but as I got older, I had to kind of navigate it, for myself in terms of like where I stood with the faith and how I individually felt about it, and I loved Islam growing up. I really did. Alhamdulillah, that was a blessing that God gave me. I just felt that I loved learning about it. But I didn't, in high school it was kind of a challenge for me a little bit. I struggled with hijab and, but it was during like the last year of high school and that summer after that I really took ownership of my own faith and said, I want to, define it for myself. And I remember I studied, I remember exploring other faiths as well. And I remember starting to divulge deeper into Islam and what it asked of me and what God wanted from me. And that was the summer after high school is really when I just committed to it on my own and started practicing from just, I knew it was 100% me wanting to. And that's when I put on hijab.
Wow, mashallah. I'd love to pick your brain a bit more about hijab, if that's okay.
Yeah, sure, no problem.
So this sounds like it was one of the milestones or kind of shifts in your faith and making it your own, as you said, or taking ownership. And, hijab is always a topic of, interest for many Muslims. And I think nowadays, I'm sure you're aware, there's a lot of different opinions and perspectives about it. And I'm wondering why you think or feel or believe that wearing the hijab is a step forward, perhaps, in your spiritual maturity. Can you tell us more about how you came to that conclusion and how you felt since you wore it?
It definitely did feel like a huge step forward in my spiritual path because, I think when you put on hijab, you're not just making one decision. You're making a bunch of decisions at the same time. First one is I'm putting God before everyone else, right? I am going to, obey God's command, right? But then it's also, I'm going to prioritize what he wants from me over everyone else. I'm going to disconnect from what the creation wants me and put what the creator wants over everyone else. I'm going to free myself from the pressures of everyone around and what they think I should do and put God before that, So it was a liberating experience for me because especially when you're coming out of high school and, you have to deal with all these pressures. And I remember I was really on and off with the hijab throughout high school because it was hard for me to wear it. And there wasn't a lot of Muslims in my community. And but so that decision for me was a freeing of myself from all of these pressures, and it was a liberating experience. And I look back and I always say this, that time was probably one of the most beautiful times of my life because I just felt like I disconnected from the opinions of all those who were not constant, right? Because people's opinions go up and down. And I connected to someone so stable, and so constant. And his opinion of me is the most important. And I felt like there was a ground firming, a firm ground under me, like where you can just walk firmly on this earth and be confident and know that your security and confidence and value is through the lens of someone far greater than anyone else. And it just, so I could sit here and say, okay, well, God said do it, and I did, right? But I think that um, there's so much more to it than that, and as with everything that Allah commands us to do.
Yeah. Now, I mean, there are some sisters out there that might think or hear this and go, well, does that mean I'm not going to achieve, a higher spiritual maturity unless I wear the hijab? What are your thoughts about that opinion? Because there are people that don't believe you have to necessarily wear the veil to achieve a higher state of spirituality. Now, how much of this, concept of hijab for you is about just the exterior versus the interior? And maybe you can address that perspective of why you think it was an integral part of your growth spiritually.
So I do understand that. I do understand that there's many different views on hijab. And, the way I look at anything that Allah commands us to do, or any aspect of our faith, is that they're all means to growing closer to God, right? So like, hijab is a means, right? Salah is a means, prayer is a means, giving charity is a means, right? And many of us are not perfect in all of them, right? And I always tell people, like, do not compare, because there are people who wear hijab but are not doing, other things. And there are people who are, maybe praying and wearing, not praying and wearing hijab. And so it's very easy to get stuck on these like what seems to be exterior identifications of what religiousness means, right? And and this is actually some of the things that I try to tackle, is that these we've attached ourselves as a community to these exterior definitions of what religiousness is, right? And 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 some of us who have that exterior identifications, right, and those markers have deceived ourselves to think, well, we're there, and
Right.
and so it's really important to tackle those things, because there are people in the community who are striving towards God but don't have those exterior markers, right? And only God knows where they stand and compared to those other people who have the exterior markers. So for me, like, these things are really about what they're doing for us internally more than anything. Somebody might be giving a lot of charity and not wearing hijab. Only God will judge that person at the end. And I look at everything as, okay, God set out all these things for us to do, and they're all pathways to Him, and we're all supposed to be striving towards achieving those pathways. But the most important thing is what they're doing to us internally. Like they say, I think there's a saying that says, a sin that humbles you is better than a deed that makes you arrogant, right?
Yeah. Wow.
At the same time, that's not to minimize them as acts of faith, right? So one of the things that I'm seeing that's happening in our community is that to address those um, who feel inadequate spiritually because other people are saying, well, you're not wearing hijab, or you're not praying, or you're not this, right? Or you don't have these exterior markers. I feel that what's happening now is to address that side. We have to almost minimize these acts of worship as acts of faith, right? Like, we have to almost disconnect between them and faith. I don't know, like, for example, like, we have to say, well, maybe like hijab is not really an act of faith, or maybe, you know what I mean? Like,
It's cultural or whatever.
it's
Yeah.
cultural or whatever. Yeah, exactly. So like, so I really think we need to hone in on balance here, and I think this is the the best way to reach more people, right? And and to actually like to explain Islam for what it is, you know.
Right.
We shouldn't compare people and try to fit them in this box of what is religious, right? Quote unquote, right? But at the same time, we shouldn't minimize things that God has said are, you know, are acts of worship, you know. So I really, these are the things that I try to tackle because there's a psychology behind this. There's a psychology behind the way we view religion and the way that we approach religion and the way that we, you know, practice it and expect other people to fit into it. You know, there's so many walks of life,
Right.
so many people with different experiences, different backgrounds, different, you know, psychologies, right? And everyone brings that to the way that they approach faith. And we need to be conscious of that, you know, because Islam is collective and it's inclusive and it incorporates all walks of life. And what we do is we create a very, you know, rigid box and label it Islam and say, well, oh, you don't fit in here. Well, that's not Islamic. And that's a man-made box. That's not a God-made box.
I'm really glad you brought that up because this is certainly something that I also have observed and you know, tend to address quite frequently, this idea of, you know, overemphasis on external acts without internal reality. And I think that sometimes in some Muslim communities, there's this emphasis of appearing religious more than actually being religious. And and then we get these kind of superficial arguments or deconstructions of, oh, well, this hijabi, I know she also does this and it's un-Islamic, so it doesn't matter if you wear hijab. And then there's people that don't wear hijab and it's like, well, they have much better character than people that do. And so there's always these back and forths of, you know, external checkpoints versus what's actually being done. And I mean, obviously the ideal situation is that your external and interior are aligned, right, and reflecting the divine pattern that Allah and His Messenger brought. But I also like how you know, highlighted here that there is, unfortunately, this idea of an Islamic packaging, you know, this cookie cutter idea. And if you don't fit into this, then, you know, you're questionable and this and that. And I think as someone who understands psychology, of course, there's a psychology of religion. I mean, imagine if somebody was beaten constantly by their mom who also wore hijab, and there's association, for instance, with this, you know, religious symbol with abuse. Obviously, that person is not going to find wearing hijab as easily as someone who never experienced that, right? So, I mean, there's so much layers to people's experiences, and I think that's a really important highlight that you shared here, that we can't just jump to these conclusions based on artificial external packaging. Yet at the same time, I heard you say we can't also change the narrative of what has been clearly established in the Deen.
Exactly, absolutely. And this is what I really love about being in this, you know, field and trying to navigate Islam and psychology, is that I'm taking into account the psychology of a person, but also how it plays a role in them practicing something that they deem the most important thing in their life, you know, and, you know, and how that affects their relationship with God and their relationship with others. It's very easy, like, you know, to look at someone and say, well, oh, they're not doing those things. But like you said, there's so many, the mind is like, you know, a network, you know, of associations that are constantly being made. And these things impact the person significantly. And the beautiful thing about providing therapy is that you can help a person, you know, unpackage that all, you know, and lay it all out and as if they're little puzzle pieces, you know, and then try to help them facilitate a process where they can put these puzzle pieces together and figure out what is from the Deen and what is from their experiences and differentiating them. But many of us are walking around with all those things meshed up into one, and we don't even know the difference.
Right. And I think also this unhealthy sometimes focus on quantification of deeds. There is this idea of like, you know, faith is this finish line. Like, oh, now, mashallah, you know, now that I've got all my Islamic garb down and I'm practicing all the rituals and I'm, you know, following as much of these sacred rules as I can. And now sometimes those people feel almost self-entitled to pick at other people about stuff, right? Like, oh, why are you wearing nail polish, sister? Your prayer isn't accepted or something. It's like, really? I mean, you've mashallah done everything in your path with Allah that now you can fixate on whether or not, you know, the sister next to you wears nail polish or plucks her eyebrows or whatever. I mean, it's just so interesting how different arguments can unfold because of the psychology of religion itself sometimes is built on these immature and imbalanced constructs to begin with. Would you say you agree with that, or would you like to challenge that?
No, I definitely, these are the things that I really reflect on a lot. And, and these are things I actually are very, like, are of great interest to me because what I'm coming to the conclusion, um, what the conclusion I'm coming to is that I think that what happens is there's a phenomena that happens when someone becomes religious, right? Um, and what I find happens for people who say have this perfectionist idea of what Islam should be. I think sometimes, and maybe not all the time, but I think it goes back to them never having a connection to themselves to begin with.
Mm.
And so, what I think, and this is something I'm developing further, but I can, I guess, share some ideas that I'm having about this with you, is that, what I find is so if you don't have, say, like from your upbringing, right? Or even culturally, because our culture, especially Middle Eastern culture or a lot of Eastern cultures, don't really foster that sense of, self love or connecting to yourself, right? It's more about the collective, right?
Right, right.
So what I think happens is and then if you add on top of that trauma, emotional struggles, all of these things, experiences in life. So people disconnect from themselves, right? And then they find this perfect entity such as Islam, right? This perfect modality, and they say, and instead of saying I want to strive to practice that, I think what people subconsciously say is I want to be that.
Mm.
Right? And
And what's the
so
difference? What's the difference there? That's an important nuance.
there's a huge difference because you cannot be something perfect, right? Like
Mm.
you cannot be Islam, and one of
Right.
the
And
things
Islam's not a person either.
Islam is
So
not a
you,
person. I'm actually working on I'm actually finishing an article right now, and I'll send it to you when it's done. It's called "My Name Is Not Islam."
I
Okay.
love that. Yeah.
Yeah, and the reason why I'm writing is because, when you approach Islam as it's something that you become, that it's like I remember Sheikh Walid Musad said, Islam is not a brand that you need to manage. It's like it's almost like people find this perfect thing and they feel so imperfect inside. They feel so disconnected inside. They feel like they don't know who they are inside. And then they find this thing and they connect to it, and they feel safe in that becoming their entire identity. And here's the thing. If you are approaching Islam and you practice it and you embody those things and that becomes part of your identity, that's okay, right? But if you are broken inside and you feel so disconnected and you feel there's all these psychological things going on, and you take Islam as if it is this something that you have to become, there is a lot of harm in that because you're walking around as perfection, and you have deceived yourself to think that you are now perfect. And it's a huge illusion. It's a huge deception. And it's something that's going to fall apart, because it's not real, and any false destination falls apart. And I think that's what's happening in our community. I think that's what's happening is that, you know, um, people feel safe in these rigid boxes that they have established that allow them to feel emotionally safe. And and then when they see anything that's different than that perfect box they built, it's not. See, this is why people freak out when they see somebody who's like different than them Islamically, right? Is because they've built this box where they've labeled Islam and they've become it, and that and any crack in that box is not just an attack on like Islam, it's an attack on their emotional and mental well-being, because that's where they feel secure, that's where they feel safe, and that's why people are not able to engage in open conversations, because any attack on Islam is like an attack on them.
Right. It threatens the ego that has been constructed around this perfect cookie cutter personification or anthropomorphized Islam.
Exactly.
Yeah, so I mean, this is something I've certainly observed as well. This idea that like Islam is not a person. People always ask me, "Well, what does Islam say? Am I going against Islam?" I said, "Well, wallahi, let's call him up and ask him."
Yeah,
you know.
exactly.
But he doesn't exist in that sense. There's no person, right, or personification. But I think it's just a very interesting point that you're making. And also what came up for me when you were sharing this is it's almost like, you know, when somebody is broken or doesn't have self-love or feels complete, you know, within themselves. I mean, obviously it's a lifelong journey, but I'm talking about just at least your core seems cohesive and you love yourself and you're clear about your gifts and your growth areas, you know, this self-awareness. People that sometimes don't have this, they tend to also crave or desire, let's say, getting married, because somehow once I get married, I'll feel complete, right? Or all my problems will go away. I'll once I feel loved, you know, I'll be able to experience a sense of value. And we know that this is not a healthy state or mentality to go into any lifelong partnership with, but sometimes it almost gets projected or displaced with the relationship to this personification of Islam. Like, oh, well, I'm broken inside, I don't know what to do with all this, and so we just assume if I just, you know, try to become really religious or perfect in my Muslimness, that somehow this is going to give me all that assurance. But the reality is you're not developing assurance of your own choices. You're not trusting in your heart and your gut. You're actually just taking a system which is very nice and packaged and polished as far as ideas, values, you know, worldview, ethos, and then we just take that label on and we're like, this is me now.
Exactly.
But it's not, you know, I always say, like, there's no factory out there that's like producing all these perfect cookie cutter Muslims, like, and they're all just walking around acting and thinking and walking, you know, looking the same, which I think is one of the points you made earlier, right? Is like, if I see a Muslim who, oh my God, they might play guitar, or they might, you know, have a different opinion in fiqh or even theologically about something that isn't from the basics, all of a sudden it's like, oh, you're not really a Muslim, right? Or you're an innovator, or you're not part of this group.
It's extreme reaction.
Right. And so, and this is actually pretty common with extremists, you know, is that they tend to have fragmented psyches, and why they become fundamentalists and extremists is because they take on an ideology that helps with this sense of inner disparity. And this is also what leads to the cult mentality, right? Why people join cults, because it gives them this sense of meaning and purpose and value and groupthink and validation that they can't find through themselves and through their relationship to the divine. So they join these types of groups, which is like, here are all the answers, right? And a lot of people, by the way, are uncomfortable with the mystery of life and knowing that you're just not always going to know. And some people don't like that. They're like, no, Islam has all the answers and all I have to do is memorize it, and then basically I'll be perfected, so to speak. So it sounds like this is also what you're referring to here.
Yeah, and I think you covered a serious reason why people don't go to therapy, is that this whole idea of, well, Islam is going to like fix me, right? Like just the whole comparison to like marriage is going to fix me. You know, I always say Allah heals, right? People say like Islam heals. It's Allah that heals. God heals, right?
Right. Islam is an instrument.
Islam is an instrument. Islam is the means, but you don't, so, and there are many means that God has put on this earth for us to heal, right? So it's like, you take medicine to heal, right? And so when it comes to, I notice when it comes to, to like emotional struggles and psychological struggles, people will not go to therapy because they say, well, if, you know, I have Islam, you know, that's, you know, and that's a really destructive, you know, viewpoint, because it will keep somebody in cycles of pain because, you know, they're afraid to go outside of that box. It's literally a fear of going outside of the box that they constructed themselves.
Right. And what most people don't realize, Marwa, is that, you know, it doesn't take away from Islam by saying I might need therapy, or I might need counseling, or I have to go see a doctor. I mean, it doesn't take away from the merit and the power of Islam. And I think this also goes back to this idea of, you know, the famous slogan, Islam is a way of life, right? And I've always had kind of an issue with that statement, not because I don't think Islam doesn't have guiding principles for life, but that, come on, it doesn't it doesn't include everything. It's basically a guidance, right, for those who are God conscious. And what that means is people who are God conscious are also going to seek the means and build bridges and understand science and how to actually heal and solve the problems of society internally and externally, right? And that is my understanding, at least, of Islam being a way of life, is that it guides you to be the best and the most excellent that you can be in all the departments of life. But it's not the same thing as saying, Islam has all the answers, so to say, because as you said earlier, I mean, what we call the Islamic tradition today, we're talking about 1,400 years of scholarship and interpretive efforts by men and women. That's not the same thing as what Allah and His Messenger brought. That's the effects of what Allah and His Messenger brought. And some people also get very uncomfortable with that idea that, hey, turns out what you call Islamic tradition today, it's actually the ideas and thoughts and intentional interpretations of men and women. So it's actually human constructions of these divine principles.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, definitely these are issues that are coming up, and ideas and questions that are coming up and are more prevalent today. And people, are questioning, well, what is actually from Islam and what's actually the interpretation of mankind, right? And so, this is where, I think studying the Deen extensively really helps. Not that everyone can do that, but I think seeking knowledge, we've also seeking knowledge is something that I think, has to be a reaction to those questions and those challenges, because they are coming up and they're very prevalent today. And I think that what we do, though, is that a lot of times we allow these challenges and these questions and we just sit with them, and then we say Islam has all the answers, but it's God that has all the answers, like we said, and Islam is a created thing, right? So it's people are placing are forgetting the source of Islam, it's almost like they stop at Islam, and Islam came from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And I think that, seeking knowledge in our time today is something that's, I feel is minimized, because we're in a world of information, not knowledge. And one of my teachers actually said this. He said, we're not in a world of knowledge anymore. We're in a world of information. Everyone's receiving all this information. Knowledge is something that's actually something that, is a result of information being applied, right? And I think what's happening nowadays is that all of these things are happening in the world, and all of these questions are coming up, and people are starting to question the boxes that have been created over the years, And I think there's a lot of benefit to that, because there's a lot of liberation in that. But I think there has to be a balance in the way that we approach breaking down these boxes, breaking down these barriers. And that's, you can't just break something without enforcing it with something else, right? You can't just find the problem without working towards a solution. And I think what's happening is a lot of us are identifying the problems. A lot of us are seeing the flaws. A lot of us are seeing how we constructed these rigid religious boxes. A lot of us are seeing, just these, unhealthy constructs that we have built when it comes to the faith. But then at the same time, we're not trying to value seeking knowledge in a way that would help us arrive at the answers, right? We're almost trusting our own minds. Okay, if I saw a flaw, that means it's wrong, right? Or if I think something's right, I mean it's wrong. It means it's wrong. And I think because we live in a world where we almost worship our opinions, and social media and all of these things, now opinions are almost like facts, we haven't really we've identified the problems, and we're great at talking about them. But very few of us are actually taking the time to actually do, put the effort to seek the knowledge that would help us address these problems.
Right. No, I totally vibe with that. Certainly seeking knowledge is very different from just having information or reading some post and not actually taking it further. And I think that part of the anxiety is when we do see something that may be contrary to what we've always believed. I think our duty out of humility and virtue is to go, well, wow, I need to read up on that or go look more into that. Why do I think this, or why is this bothering me? I mean, that's usually a sign that our consciousness is yearning for discovery, so to speak.
No, absolutely. I think our reactions need to change to our confusion. We're, as a community, we're responding to confusion in a very unhealthy way, I think. And it's instead of like humbling our minds and taking it to God, or taking it to or seeking knowledge or doing what we need to do to address it, we're just like relying on our minds, and saying, well, if I arrived at this conclusion, it must be right. And this is common in a world where intelligence is almost worshipped. The mind is worshipped, and there isn't much respect for the heart and the role the heart plays in these things. So yeah, there's definitely something in that, in the way that we approach our confusion, and there's a lot of confusion nowadays.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, actually, I was just having the same discussion yesterday, and it was the person was having trouble with evil in the world and how to reconcile that with belief in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and they were losing their faith, and they kept saying, this isn't rational, and if God made me with reasoning skills, then everything has to make sense to me in order for me to accept God. And I'm like, well, aren't you giving too much power to the mind or the reasoning skills that we have, and also assuming that your reasoning can help you have absolute knowledge? I mean, we don't even understand how human consciousness works fully. How are you now going to try to understand supreme consciousness when we don't even know ourselves fully? Exactly. So that's one thing. And then I also brought up this idea of, in Islamic psychology, the organ of perception is also the heart.
Right.
Why don't you talk to us a bit more about this and what you mean by that, and how it's actually applicable in our daily lives and spirituality? How is the heart something that we as Muslims have to consider a vital part of our understanding and perception, in your opinion?
So actually, this is an approach that I developed to psycho-spiritual education and healing, and it's called the heart over mind and ego approach. And the reason I developed this, and I touched base a little bit at that in the conference that me and you did together back with Muslim Wellness Foundation, I touched base on the heart being the king, right? And the reason why this is something that I feel just I've learned through not only my own personal journey, but also through my professional experience. I think there in our society in West, through Western thought and through just our ideas here in the West, is that the mind is the know-it-all, right? It's the leader of our being. It's the king of our being. And if you know something, it's true, right? And if you have arrived at a thought, it must be real, right? And so, or if something is measurable, it's physical, it's rational, it has a much higher value than anything that can come from the heart, right? And this is something that's promoted in our society. You'll even see pictures of where the heart will have like a Band-Aid on it, right? And the brain will say, I told you so, like those little cartoons, right? So we as a society have diminished the role of the heart, but as I was studying like Islam while doing my studies in psychology, and then later on I did my doctoral research in Islamic psychology, so seeing those two worlds come together, one of the things I throughout my studies, I was always going back and saying, okay, if I studied something in psychology, go back to Islam and see how God would teach it in the Quran, right? Or teach it in our faith. And what I noticed is, like, in the Quran, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, when he talks about intellect or understanding, it's not always in reference to the mind, right? A lot of times he'll say, do they not have hearts that understand? And there are many other verses that equate the heart with understanding, the heart with cognition, the heart with intellect, right? So there is this facet within us that has been extremely dismissed and neglected, and minimized so that we can give more power to the mind, right? But in the Quran, Allah, when he talks about intellect, he talks about it sometimes with the mind and sometimes with the heart, So Allah gave us two different kinds of intellect, and I believe they work differently, But the reason I say the heart is king is, well, number one, when we go back to God, it's a sound heart that we're supposed to be bringing back, not a sound mind, right? And so that right there tells me that the most important thing, the the most valuable thing, the thing that I have to give the highest priority to within my being is the heart. And um, and then also the hadith where the Rasul Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam says, there's a that if the heart is sound, the whole body is sound, and everything else is sound. I don't know word for word the hadith, but basically the emphasis again is on the heart. And if the heart is sound, everything else is sound, right? But there's many different examples, and this is a whole um, you know, it could be a whole different discussion. It'll take a while for me to explain, but the point is that I just started to realize that like people struggle when they put this burden on their mind that Allah did not ask them to, and it's recognizing that we as human beings have an inner psycho-spiritual system is really valuable. When we study, like when we look at anything in the world, they're all systems, right? We look at the solar system, we look at in our body, we have our digestive system, our respiratory system, right? And when you look at these systems and when you study them, it's not enough to know the entities that exist in the system. It's not enough to know that in the solar system there's planets and there's the sun, right? You have to know the orbit. It's not enough for you to know that, in the digestive system there's a stomach and there's a large intestine. It's not enough. You have to know the flow, because if the flow is off, there isn't harmony, there isn't stability. And you have to know what is the center organ in that system, right? So, if you look at the solar system, we know that the planets revolve around the sun, right? And that is because the sun has the strongest gravitational pull. And if the planets revolved around anything else, there would be chaos, because there wouldn't be anything to have a strong enough gravitational pull to sustain that flow, right? And, so in every system, there's the entities, there's the flow, and there's the center, the leader, the king of that system, right? And within our psycho-spiritual system, there are entities, but there has to be a leader, right? Because then there would be chaos, right? And if we give power to the wrong leader, there's also going to be chaos, because it's not going to be able to sustain the flow. And so, studying Islam and psychology has just allowed me to come to the conclusion that, the heart was meant to be the king. Okay, always the heart was meant to be the king. Everything else in that system is there to serve this most noble part of us. And what we have done is we have made the mind the king and we have made the heart the servant, right? The heart is just tagging along. And this is really destructive. Or worse, we have made the ego the king, and then the heart and the mind are tagging along. And so it's, making the heart the king means that I am conscious of what I'm absorbing through my mind, because I want to serve this most noble part of me. Making sure that my ego is in check, because the most noble part of me needs to thrive. It's a complete shift of how you view your inner self, your inner being. And this goes back to a lot of the, tazkiyah and tasawwuf, practices like muraqabah, being watchfulness, being aware that God is watching you, and all the inner shifts that are happening within you. It's almost like mindfulness on a whole different level, taking into account God and Him being present with what's going on inside of you. And this promotes a connection to ourselves, a being present with ourselves and what's happening internally. And many of us are disconnected from ourselves. So this is actually the approach that I'm developing currently and writing about.
Very exciting. Now, I'm really happy you shared that, and I wanted to ask you, okay, but there's probably some people who are like, well, what are these guys talking about?
Yeah.
Is there an example or two that maybe you've observed, personally or with others, that you're like, okay, here's an example of how the heart works and how the mind works, and how they may give us different information or knowledge, so to speak?
I'll give a sign of why I think the heart is king, and then I'll give an example. We know in sujood, right? Sujood is the closest position we are to our creator, right? And what we're putting to the forehead is this most frontal part of our mind, right? And we know in psychology that's called the prefrontal cortex, right? And we know that that's the part that's that's responsible for high decision making, for abstract thinking, for all the high executive functioning skills, right? That differentiate us from animals, right? That make us the superior being, right? And this part of our mind we put to the ground, and we humble it to the ground. And yet in that position of sujood, the heart is above the mind, right? And so there's something there about humbling the mind so that your heart can rise, like there's something, I believe there's a sign in that closest position we are to our creator, that God is showing us that this mind is not the king, and yet it's the most noble position, right? And the heart in that position is higher than the mind. And so there, an example I can give is that we go through experiences in life, right? Where they're hard to understand. They're hard to understand. We don't know why they happened. We don't know how to figure them out. We don't know how to figure figure out a solution. And so when the mind is king, what we do is, the mind is like a machine, right? It only can work with the information that it has absorbed, right? Because that's what happens is it absorbs information through the senses, through the eyes, through sight, through hearing, through touch, right? Through the five senses. And it absorbs this information, it processes it, it stores it. And when we go through experiences, we go to our mind and we say, get me a solution, right? You're the king, get me a solution. You have all the solutions. Get me an answer. And the mind comes back, the mind processes, thinks, checks everything, comes back to us with nothing, right?
Right. Sometimes even more anxiety and confusion.
Well, I believe the more anxiety and confusion comes from is now the ego, right? Or the nafs is not comfortable with that. The nafs loves comfort. The ego loves comfort. So wait, no, that's not okay that it came back with nothing. Go again. Let's check it again, right? So the mind goes back. You think about it in different ways, and you put this burden on your mind to think of it from all different angles, right? Because now you're not comfortable because your mind is king, your ego is not tamed, your heart is lagging behind, so it can't help you right now, right? And so you're like putting this burden on your mind to think again, and it just comes back to you with nothing. And now the anxiety is up because you're not comfortable. We never tamed our nafs to be okay in sitting in not knowing. We never tamed our nafs, and our heart is not strong enough to take the lead because we never made it the lead, Now, in a situation where the heart is the lead, right? There's less anxiety, I believe, because the heart is connected to its source, okay? And the heart can step in and say, okay, well, you don't know, right? And that's okay. The heart can sit and be present with its creator. The heart can experience, it has the capacity to experience this different kind of understanding, to see meaning in life from things that are not physical, from things that are not measurable, right? It's the ability to say, God is in control. It's the ability to say, it's okay that I don't know. It's the ability to say, I can just sit here with not knowing. But this only happens when the heart can be present. And the heart needs to be present in any of these practices, even mindfulness, right? Mindfulness, or even the meditation practices. The challenge is to quiet and channel your thoughts so that your heart can be present in the moment, right? And it takes them a long time to do that, especially when they've trained their mind to be the king for so long, right? And so this is just an example of, what happens to us when we struggle, why we struggle when our mind is king. And that, our heart was created for a great potential. And we have minimized that potential. And we have disconnected it from its source a lot of times. And that's where it gets its fuel. And that's where it gets, its ability to thrive. And this has to go back to our belief that Allah gave us this heart to connect to Him, and to help us navigate our world, and to help us navigate our experiences. But we dismiss this most powerful tool that God gave us, and we make everything else, give it a higher priority.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that. And one of the ways I've kind of liked to frame it is this idea that the heart is responsible for unicity and unifying things, and the mind or the brain is responsible for understanding duality. and definitions and problem solving and these types of things.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, the two have to work together, and they feed off of each other naturally. And kind of an example that I always thought was so intriguing in the Quran is this idea of, like, when you have the prophets who performed miracles, there were still people who saw something like this, a miracle, and they still had the mental capacity to still deny it and say, no, that's not it, right? It was a hallucination, or this is magic, or, it's something else. I'm basically going to ignore what my brain just processed. And from my humble understanding, the Quran is showing us that this is because their hearts are diseased or dead, right? In other words, it doesn't matter if the angels come down to your face and is like, hey, this is the real stuff. If the mind, if the heart is diseased, the mind can see all that it sees and still not process it the way it's supposed to, in this unified central way that you're kind of describing. And I always found that to be very profound, that you can have people who see miracles and can still have the capacity to say, no, I deny that. And perhaps this is an example that kind of builds off of what you're sharing here. What are your thoughts?
Well, I think you hit a very important point, which is, even on the path of spiritual growth, right? Or on the path of finding answers, about the Deen, or seeking knowledge, or just on the path of any growth that we're trying to achieve, right? If you are disconnected from your entire being, meaning that if you are walking on this path with your mind being with your, like, using solely your mind, right? You're going to miss the answers when you see them. You're going to miss the opportunities of growth when you see them, because you need the heart to kind of derive these meanings from experiences, right? That the mind cannot. They have two different types of intellect. And a lot of times people will go on this path, for example, of seeking knowledge, but they're doing it solely from their mind, right? Because they believe, like, it's 100% all mind right now, all rational. And they miss out on a lot of the answers that they're seeking because they haven't connected to other parts of themselves, And I think what you're saying is very valuable, because, and the Quran highlights this, is that if we depend on our mind so much that we negate, the condition of our hearts, we're actually going to be blinded from the answers themselves.
Right, totally. Now, can you share with us a bit more about, okay, so if someone's hearing this and they're like, all right, this sounds good to me, but how do I even awaken or activate my heart? What from your knowledge are some of the techniques or ways that we can do this from an Islamic perspective or a psychological perspective?
I think there's many different ways, but, I think prayer is such a great opportunity, and even what we do before prayer is such a great opportunity, because what happens is, prayer is a time where you recognize how much your mind is king, or which of your, like, what of your inner facets is the lead, right? And a lot of times when we go to prayer and say, like, we get distracted or whatever, we always attribute it to shaitan. We always attribute it to something external right away, right? And while I do believe shaitan plays a role, we have dismissed our personal responsibility, and because we're so disconnected from ourselves, we don't even realize what we're taking to pray. Are we taking solely our minds to pray? Are we taking solely our limbs? Are we taking our heart, our egos? And so prayer is just like, people take years to perfect meditation, right? And to perfect, the ability to be present in their hearts, right? In meditation. And we have underutilized prayer. We really have. And it's such a gift and such a blessing from God. Just the example I was giving to you is sujood, right? Sujood I think can be a healing practice just on its own, because you're in this position, this most noble and the closest position. We know this, right? In Islam, that I think it's a hadith that this is the closest position we are to our Creator, right? And in this position, God is just aligning you. Your mind is humbled, your heart is higher. You're like so close, you're so grounded, and it's such a powerful place to be, you know? And when you connect to that, like even in meditation, you're connected to your body, right? Your yoga, or all these things, all these practices out there, you have to be connected to everything that's happening within you, your body, your
Yeah.
heart, your emotions,
Unification of the self.
unification, exactly. And prayer, like if in sujood we just connect to the way our body is positioned, if we just connect to the fact that my mind that thinks it knows it all and trying to figure everything out, if we just connect to the fact that it's touching the earth right now, that's touching the ground, it's being rooted again, you know, and like, you know, and the fact that my heart is above my mind right now, and the fact that I'm in this position, like, you know, there's so many things that we can connect to just from that position that we're so disconnected from. And so I think prayer is a great way to start, because in those moments you can recognize which of your inner psycho-spiritual like facets are the lead. When you're in prayer, is your mind, if your mind is always like, well, did I feel that recitation? How, you know, like your mind is always trying to kind of control your heart, right? Like, or not control, but like it has a stronger voice, right? So like it'll be in prayer, and it'll be constantly thinking about what you're doing in prayer, instead of just allowing your heart to just be present with God. I believe that all our hearts, Allah has put already this like inner spark, right? This spark might have different degrees in different people, but I believe it's there for everyone, you know? And I believe it's like, a spark, or like when you're trying to start a fire, there's like this initial spark, and you have to harness it in order for it to grow stronger, right? You have to kind of like hone it in, and you have to kind of, I don't know, like fuel it more, right? It could grow. And so this is in us, maybe on different levels, even if it's a speck, right? Like your heart still has something that responds to the one who made it, right? And what we do is when we go to prayer, we allow our mind to speak for our heart. Our mind is almost like this, like, you know, like when you're in a gathering and there's this quiet person's trying to speak, and there's this loud person that's always like interrupting and trying, and this person's just trying to like be, you know. I always think of our mind as like that, like just be quiet, for a second. My heart, let this poor little, you know, this heart within us know, it knows what to do, and I believe it does know what to do, you know. And so one of the things that I would encourage, and using like the heart over mind and ego approach, I tell people to, like, you know, just allow your heart to just be, you know. And this takes practice outside of prayer. It can't just begin the moment you say Allahu Akbar, you know, like it has to be something that you're practicing in your life, and it has to be something that you're like, things that you're doing. For example, being able to sit in the stillness, you know, not going to a quiet place, or reflecting, going out into nature, sitting in quiet moments and being okay with that. Because what happens is, when we're not okay in the stillness, when we're not okay being around in quiet like spaces, prayer becomes, when we go to pray, that becomes the first time we experience quietness. And so what happens is all of the noise comes, right? Because we're not used to that. So
Right.
I tell people, I tell myself and others, you know, to practice sitting in the stillness outside of prayer, so that when you go to prayer, it's not something new, and you have less work to do on quieting and channeling your thoughts, you know. But if you don't have that practice outside, if you're always around noise, if every time you get into the car, you have to blast some music, if every time you have to go sit somewhere, you have to call a friend, you know, and you're not able to just sit with yourself and sit with God and have those quiet moments, prayer is always going to be a challenge. You're really depriving yourself of knowing what it means to have a heart that prays. You know, you're going to experience a mind that prays, limbs that pray, but you're really depriving yourself of hearts that pray, of a heart that prays. And I think so. It's a lot of things. It's being able to sit in the quietness, in the stillness, and being okay with yourself in those moments. And then when you go to pray, it's being able to say, no, my mind does not know better. You know, when the mind starts to say, well, oh, did I say that recitation good? Or did I, you know, I'm not feeling it. I'm not feeling it. I'm not, this whole concept of I'm not feeling it. You know,
Feeling it.
you know
Yeah.
where I learned this concept of I'm not feeling it? I learned it from my own personal experience. And that's why I said, like, coming to this heart over mind and ego approach, it's rooted in both professional but personal experiences for me. And I remember the first time I went to Umrah to do how do you translate this? The small pilgrimage, right? Yeah. When I went to do Umrah, like I remember I was so in my mind, right? Because this is such a grand experience, right? And you want to make sure you feel what you're supposed to feel, right? Again, it's like we've defined this box that says this is what spirituality and spiritual high looks like, right? And I better feel like that, like I have to feel like that.
There's expectations and attachments to the feelings or the experience of just going to Mecca or during prayer. And if it doesn't happen, then we start to question these definitions and the process itself. But it's really about going back to us.
Exactly. And, and so I remember learning this firsthand through my own experience because, I remember going there and as we were walking, to the Kaaba, I remember I was like, everyone was like, everyone cries when they see the Kaaba, right? These are things that are talked about. We talk a lot about the way we're supposed to feel in Ramadan and the way we're supposed to feel when we see the Kaaba and the way we're supposed to feel when we experience these emotional things, right? We're obsessed with this idea of what spirituality looks like emotionally, right? And so I remember going and I remember like being so like, I like, this is how I'm supposed to feel and being worried that I'm not going to like cry or have like an emotional reaction. And I was so in my mind that when I saw the Kaaba, I did not cry, and in response to that, I was like so upset too. I was like, oh, great,
Yeah. What does this say about me and my faith and all
exactly.
this? Yeah.
And when you see other people crying and you're like, man, I must be like, so like, I learned a lot from that. The first time I went to Umrah, I went with my mind, and this was the beginning of me really developing these concepts and understanding this. And I had my own experience to kind of relate to it, and once I allowed myself to quiet and like allow my heart to just really like take the lead, I stopped letting my mind criticize my heart's experience, and just let it be, go with the flow. And just, and the second time I went to Umrah, it was a completely different experience for me,
I really appreciate that sharing, and especially of the personal anecdote here. So what I'm hearing you say is the heart has a voice, and sometimes that voice is silenced or is never heard because of the constant mental egoic chattering that many of us have. And that's, fine. Doesn't make you a bad person, but that's a reality that I think a lot of people can relate to. It's like my mind can't turn off. It's always talking. For many people, when they start to pray, they're still thinking about all the external stuff. Like, oh, I have to pick up my kids. I still have to do the laundry and this and that. And then before you know it, you finish prayer and you didn't even think about God or yourself in existence. And so there's a point of almost getting from outside to just getting in your body. And then once you get in your body, there's still the journey of constantly thinking about what you're doing in the prayer rather than just being present as you're describing. And kind of what came up for me is a nice analogy here. It's almost like the mind is like this flashlight. It gives you awareness about certain patterns or constructs of how we assemble the world, but yet the heart almost offers like a type of flame, building off of this spark idea that you're sharing, right? And it's like the more we allow that spark to have some oxygen, right, and the right elements, it's going to become a candle, and then that candle can become a greater flame. And the difference between like a flashlight or electrical light is, a fire has warmth as well. And I would argue it's even more beautiful to look at. And it can't necessarily be contained in the sense of a flame doesn't necessarily burn and dance exactly the way you want it. It's not as predictable, so to speak, right? Whereas the mind, we want everything to be predictable and familiar, and anything that goes against that, it just makes us feel uncomfortable. And sometimes that's what's blocking us from, sinking down into the body or awakening that heart and realizing this is a central compass of the divine pattern that sometimes we don't even use or harness. Would you say that's a good summary?
Yeah, no, that's a really beautiful, very good summary, mashallah. It's a very beautiful description and definitely speaks to what I was saying. Yeah.
So, Dr. Marwa, I'd like to circle back to some of the themes we discussed at the beginning of this conversation, this idea of knowing oneself and knowing one's personal truth and how to navigate that space, because it can get confusing for some people. Some people today, they think, well, this is my truth, but the truth may not necessarily be aligned with an Islamic principle or otherwise. And I'd love to hear more of your thoughts about this idea of how knowing oneself and knowing one's truth is such an important component of the spiritual religious path.
Well, what comes to mind when you say that is the saying in our Deen, "Man arafa nafsahu arafa rabbahu," whoever knows himself knows his Lord. And, knowledge of anything should point to the creator of that knowledge, right? Or the creator of what we're witnessing. And the way that I understood this was that, when you, for example, when you appreciate the sun or the moon, or when you reflect on nature, when you get to know how, the creation, right? It should put you back to who made this, right? When you appreciate the beauty of the sunset, we say subhanallah, because that knowledge, that witnessing takes us to the one who has allowed this to happen, And I think what differentiates Islamic psychology and Western thought and ideas, especially when it comes to living authentically or being your true self, is that the source is not us, right? And so it's great to go on this path of knowing your truth and knowing yourself, but you can't be the destination. We are not the destination when it comes to understanding ourselves through an Islamic psychological perspective. Is that we are not designed to be the destination. We are not the destination. We are not the source. We're not designed to be the source. And so knowledge of ourselves should lead us to reflecting on who made us. When you look at a piece of art, you want to know who the artist is, right? So in recognizing that we are art and that we are beautiful and that we are a creation and that we are created honorable and with love, it should take us to the artist, to the one who fashioned us, and Musawwir, the one who, the creator, the one who has made us uniquely the way we are, And so I think what happens on this path of knowing ourselves is we stop at ourselves, and that can be very destructive. Also, to find truth, right? We have to ask ourselves, do I want to arrive at truth that's through my own lens or through the lens of God, right? And so we can't do it alone. Allah is al-Haq, right? He is the source of all truth that exists and that we know of, right? And many of us go on this path of seeking truth without including al-Haq, without connecting to al-Haq. And it's something that's, to go on a spiritual path without the source of truth it's incomplete, because we have to, there's always, a little self-doubt is always healthy, everything in balance is good, too much self-doubt is destructive, right? But too little self-doubt can also be destructive, because if you don't even have like a grain of, or like space within yourself to give yourself room to think that possibly I could be wrong, that could be destructive too, right? Because so I think that on this path we should embark on it, and we should be enthusiastic about it. We should be optimistic. We should be hopeful, but we should also depend on the one who will guide and pave our way. And I think even when it comes to ourselves, like we forget this concept, right? We don't apply this concept when it comes to other things, like for example, risk, right? We say, okay, I want a new job. I want this. Okay, I'm going to ask God, right? It's much easier for us to do that to ask God when it comes to these exterior things, right? But when it comes to internal things, we don't realize that Allah giving us, showing us truth is a form of risk. Allah, all our personality traits that we're trying to connect to, when you connect to yourself and know more about yourself, we're connecting to things that Allah has provided us with, and we forget to ask Allah to open our path to understanding ourselves and to understanding our path the same way that we would do it when we'd ask for a new job and whatever we want, in life. And so, being connected to al-haq while you're on the path of truth is so important. It just seems that it it can't be any other way, you know?
Yeah. No, that's very interesting point. And for some people, it's also confusing to know what is truth. But I think as Muslims, we have at least a guide and a path, so to speak, right? Sirat al-Mustaqim. And I mean, just the Fatiha itself, we could spend hours talking about that meaning. But one thing that came up for me as you were sharing is this idea of, even in Fatiha we say Iyaka na'budu wa Iyaka nasta'in, and the ibadah, worshiping God. I mean, it has a very broad definition in Arabic, and it means to serve and to adore and to love and to obey, to follow, etc. And it also means to depend, right? If I worship somebody, I'm also depending on them to get stuff or to make me feel better. But then the second verse after Iyaka na'budu, we still have wa Iyaka nasta'in, which is like, and you're the only one I depend on. So it's like you're that source of truth and illumination that I really have to truly depend on. And I always found that very interesting. And from my teachers, this is one of the emphasis of the Fatiha that, many people sometimes overlook. It's like, why would we say you alone we worship, and then it's followed by you alone we depend on? Because worship includes dependency as well.
Absolutely. Yeah, definitely. And I think it's very easy to forget to seek God's help when it comes to illuminations that we're trying to arrive at internally, or when it comes to things that are going on with us on a mental and emotional or spiritual level. It's very easy to take ownership of that because it's something internal and we think it's within us. So we're deceived to think that the source of the answers are within us too, And when it comes to things outside of us, it's very easy to identify, well, that's outside of me. I need someone outside of me to help me with it, But to recognize that everything that you have internally is also connected to God. It's also from God. Like we don't take the time to, when we show gratitude, many times people will show gratitude towards everything external, which is great, but it's limited because, God didn't just give us, a roof over our heads. He didn't just give us, shelter, safety, or food. Everything that we possess internally is also a form of provision from Him. It's a gift from Him. Like your unique personality trait. Thank God for that. Your approachableness. Thank God for that. Your heart. Thank God for that. Whatever goodness is in your heart, thank Him for that. Thank Him for all these internal beauties that you have within you. The fact that the certain strengths you identified within. This is what man arafa nafsahu arafa rabbahu means. To know yourself is to know God. When you recognize a strength within you, you thank the one who gave it to you. When you recognize a beauty within you, you thank the one who blessed you with it. And we do this. We're so limited when it comes to our gratitude because, and Allah tells us, like, if you thank me, I will increase you, right? And so like we don't take the time to thank God for our internal realities. We're so connected to what is external, and that we're just busy thanking God for our external realities, and we shouldn't stop that. But I'm saying that we have to connect more to ourselves. Allah gave us like an inner world that's complex and beautiful, and it's the way of navigating our life towards Him, and we're so disconnected from that. And, and we're missing out. We're really deprived of a holistic experience of our lives, because we're so disconnected and we don't really learn to connect to ourselves. I don't think that's something that's taught to us. I think that's something that many of us are taught to connect to external things, right? You connect to what society expects of you. You connect to what your culture expects of you, to what the boxes that people have constructed expect of you. But we're not encouraged, or we're not taught to connect to our truth, to our souls, to the fact that there's this inner reality within us that's unique, and that God has fashioned uniquely and taken the time to mold you uniquely. No two human beings are alike, and it's and to know that is to know your potential, and to connect to that is to know how you're going to maximize your time here on this earth. And when you do that, I believe that when people can connect to what's internal and to, turn inward, I believe that's when people can work better together. Like a lot of people like who are like say like threatened by other people or have insecurities. I think that goes back to a place of not knowing your power and truth, and not knowing what God has equipped you with. Because when you are busy with what God has blessed you with, you don't have time to compare yourself to other people. Gratitude makes you so, it makes you indulge in the things that He has already given you, and you want to use them, because the highest form of gratitude is to use what God gave you. And the highest form of ingratitude is to dismiss what He gave you. And that's an internal thing too. Like we think it's humbleness to play small and to not utilize what God has given us. And that's something we all fallen of. And I remember it was a challenge for me that I had to navigate as well, but I realized, playing small or negating what Allah has given me is actually an ingratitude to the giver. It's a form of ingratitude to the giver. It's like me giving someone a gift and I watch them just shun it to the side. Would I feel like they're grateful? No. And so there's all these cultural things that we have to cultural obstacles that we have to tackle when it comes to the way that we view ourselves, the way that we view humbleness, the way that we view connecting to ourselves, trusting ourselves. There's so many things to navigate that I think a lot of external things have played a role in us having an unhealthy relationship with those things.
Absolutely. No, I thank you for sharing that. I mean, it reminds me of one of my favorite verses in the Quran, فَاذْكُرُونِي أَذْكُرُكُمْ. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, remember me and I'll remember you. And I just get goosebumps just saying it and thinking about how Rabb al-Alameen can remember you just if you remember Him. It's such a precious, priceless gift and acknowledgement of the divine relationship. And in the same verse it says, وَاشْكُرُونِي وَلَا تَكْفُرُونَ. So, and be grateful to me, and don't be an ingrate, or don't deny or cover up the blessings I've given you. So in this verse, it's actually talking about what you're saying, that the gratitude is one of the ways that you connect and are present with the divine. And ingratitude is even synonymous with a state of kufr, which means to cover up the truth and deny the favors of your Lord. And so I love how you explain this, because it is certainly a strong theme in the Quran. And, attitude, gratitude, something that I always try to remind myself of. It's an attitude we have to have. It's like anything else. It has to be consciously engaged with and practiced, because then that becomes your default setting or mode of functioning, right? You get up and you're like grateful first before complaining about all the stuff you don't have and want. And many people live with these external checklists, and if it doesn't go my way, then I question God, and why is God doing this to me? And it's like, subhanAllah, I mean, wanting to control everything is a disease of the heart too. And it's like the whole Deen, istislam wa muslim wa aslamna, it's all about, hey, surrendering and having security in the one that actually controls everything, every atom in the universe, every cell in your body. And yet I'm still trying to live life as if I can control everything and all my plans are going to go just the way I want it. And then when we get a curveball from the universe, all of a sudden it's like, wait a minute, I'm a good Muslim. Why this shouldn't be happening to me? I wasn't supposed to get divorced, or I wasn't supposed to lose this family member, or I was supposed to get this job, and so on and so forth, right? But this again goes back to this idea of egoic attachments, which I know we just scratched the surface on. And that's why we're going to have you on again soon, Dr. Marwa.
Yeah, I'd love to, inshallah. I'd love to be back.
Dr. Marwa, it's been a pleasure to have you on the show today, and I hope we can have more conversations like this over some more coffee in the future.
Absolutely. I look forward to it. Thank you for having me. It was great. Thank you.
Karim Deen here. Thank you for tuning in. Please visit nurhuman.com to learn more about how I provide personal, spiritual, and relationship counsel and growth. Don't forget to visit coffeewithkareem.com to see the latest news and updates about this podcast. Please generously help sponsor the show to keep on going at patreon.com/coffeewithkareem. That's patreon.com/coffeewithkareem.